Alright, hello everyone, and in this video I'm going to be showing you a few tips for when you're using the optimizer to build a cache lineup. And if you've seen the GPP lineup video, this is going to be very similar, but the first thing I'm going to do is put an X in the importing cache settings box. And you can see over here various values that have been imported to the constraint section of the toggle bar that we think are important things to consider when you are building a cache lineup. So for example, we didn't touch ownership because in cache lineups, it actually makes sense to roster highly owned players for the simple reason that if those players play well and you don't have them, and a large percent of the field does, you're going to be in a tough spot. And when you're in a cache lineup where your only goal is being in the top half of the field, your main focus should really be to maximize your exposure to players that you think are going to play well, of course, but then also minimize the risk that you get left behind. So we don't put any constraint on ownership there. We do put a constraint on projected minutes because we want to minimize our exposure to high risk players who aren't going to play a ton of minutes. And really all this is going to do is it's going to exclude you from picking players at the 3,000 salary range, maybe at the 3,500 salary range, who are borderline plays in maybe could be a good GPP lineup play, but are definitely higher risk plays. Moving along, we don't do anything to potential rating. We do add another usage constraint. Again, in a cache lineup, you're going to want someone who has a high floor, and those are typically players who are going to have higher usage rates. So we implement a usage minimum of 15. We don't touch the matchup statistics. I talked about this in the last video, but if you did want to incorporate a player who has a good matchup, you could go ahead and put in a 10 here, and you can go look through all the possible options you have. And one thing you could definitely do, and I talked about this again in the last video, but I'll do it here, is you could select a couple players who you definitely want in your lineup based on the criteria you have and who have a really good matchup. So let's say tonight I wanted Siakam and Montrezl Harrell. I could come up here to cache locks, and I could go Pascal Siakam and Mon. Wish I picked easier names to spell. But there you go. Now that I spelled them correctly, you'll see them pop up in the real locks. So whatever I do now, whatever additional constraints I implement, those guys are going to be locked into my lineup, and I know they're in some great matchups tonight. I think in a cache lineup, matchups are something I definitely value pretty highly. I'm typically looking for at least half my roster, maybe even more, to be guys who are in positive matchups, and that is reflected in projected points. But I also like to do it manually a couple times if I am building a cache lineup. Final thing is consistency rating. So this looks at the standard deviation of a player's scores. One thing I will note here is that, and we actually do this in our consistency rating, but if a player hasn't played a lot of games and is suddenly expected to jump into a huge role, he's probably going to have a pretty low consistency rating. And an example of this could be an Emmanuel Quickly, for example, who is typically playing 10, 15 minutes a game, but when Elfrid Payton goes down injured, he's going to jump into a much bigger role and should probably be a cache lineup play. So in those cases, we would probably include him in the cache locker exclude column, but it's important to note that you don't always want to remove some of those guys who haven't played as many games just because they don't have as high of a consistency rating. Again, some things to consider are the total ownership percentage. It's actually important when building a cache lineup, and I'll go ahead and optimize with these settings so we can see what we get here. But it's actually important when building a cache lineup to consider rostering some, as I talked about before, some highly owned players. So if I first got my threshold by optimizing with no settings in and saw that the total ownership was 120%. And then I implemented a bunch of settings and saw that the ownership percentage was 60%. I might think that that's actually a better GPP lineup than it is a cash lineup. And I might have to reconsider some of the settings I have implemented. And then again, same deal with the projected point total. Of course, it's a projection, so there is some variation that's going to be had when you make those adjustments, but don't allow it to go into the 30s or 40s when you're making those adjustments. But that should really wrap up this video on the cache settings. One thing you can do too, and you should definitely note, is that if you want to exclude certain players, you can always exclude them in this column by entering an N. All right, I hope you guys enjoyed this, and I will see you in the next one.